Okay, welcome back to Tehillim, and we are starting today a new one, number Ayin Ches, which is 78. And the truth is, I believe this is probably the longest one that we've had up until this point. It's 72 psukim. I hope that it does not take 72 weeks to get through this Tehillim, and so obviously we're going to have to skip around to pull out the main points that we can. But just the introduction alone itself will probably take most of today's class, because it's a very in-depth Tehillim, and there's a lot to be said about it, and it will help us to be able to appreciate what it's coming to do. So we turn to Rabbi Foyer, who we always do at the beginning of our Tehillim, each new one, and he points out the following. And this Tehillim is going to be a survey of history of spanning over 400 years. It's going to go back to the days that we were in bondage in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, and it concludes with the reign of Dovid HaMelech, which was 400 years after that time. And if you look at all of the events that took place between Yetzias Mitzrayim and Malchus Beis Dovid, when Dovid HaMelech became the king, if you look at the events themselves, it almost looks like they're out of order, and there is no rhyme, and there's not much reason to what is going on. However, as we've learned many times throughout Tehillim, that the discerning student of Jewish history quickly discovers the varied events of these 4 centuries all stem from a single source, which means that there is a clear connection that's going to run through all of these events. And that is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has a desire that His holy Torah should be the supreme authority over Klal Yisrael. That's what Hashem wants. And whatever HaKadosh Baruch Hu needs to do in order to ensure that the Torah is going to be supreme, Hashem does. Sometimes it is in a way of great blessing and tremendous miracles and tremendous chesed from Hashem. And sometimes HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to come and He has to humble the Jewish people because of the mistakes that we are making, to remind us who we really are, what we're really all about, and bring us back to the world of Torah and of mitzvahs. So he points out over here that before the Torah was given, Klal Yisrael was falling into the unfortunate assimilation of Egypt and their society. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu humbled us at that point. He made us into slaves. And the humility that we achieved while we were slaves, it prepared us to be able to receive the Torah as the exclusive authority over us. Remember, until you know what it means to serve a master, how are you going to accept the Torah and serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the master of the universe? The Torah is HaKadosh Baruch Hu's instruction manual of everything that He wants from us. But if Klal Yisrael is not ready to receive that, and they're not ready to hear that, so then Har Sinai could be the most miraculous, amazing revelation in the history of the world, but we don't know what it means to subjugate ourselves to somebody else. So Hashem planned everything out. Again, we went into Mitzrayim. We did not have to assimilate. We could have stayed under the umbrella of Yaakov Avinu and the Shiftei Kal, the tribes, and we could have lived our lives as Yidden, and there would have been a way for us to develop in the land of Goshen, which was the suburbs, eventually go out, go into the Midbar, receive the Torah, come into Eretz Yisrael. Everything would have been perfect. But Klal Yisrael, as we are notorious for, we make mistakes. We're not perfect. And the greater that a person is, the greater is the Yetzer Hara. So the more potential that Klal Yisrael has, the more likely we are to stumble and to fall, because we're not watching ourselves. And so they slipped into deep assimilation in Mitzrayim. And Hashem said, I have to humble you. I have to make you realize what it means to be an Eved, a slave that is going to have a master, where you have no choice but to listen to the master. And we served the Egyptians 210 years of back-breaking slave labor, but that trained us how to accept the yoke of servitude, which Hashem is going to give us when we receive the Torah. And it's not going to be servitude at that point, it's going to be freedom for Klal Yisrael. The receiving of the Torah was part of the redemption from Egypt. It's part of the Geula, part of the freedom, because the Torah is the only thing in the world that gives us the cherus, the spiritual freedom, the freedom from our Yetzer Hara, the freedom from the desires, the freedom from the nations of the world around us. It's the only thing that allows us to gravitate towards HaKadosh Baruch Hu all of the time in everything that we're doing. And so therefore the humility that we reached through the slavery in Egypt was all part of Hashem's plan, although that it was torturous, and it was tormentful, I don't know, whatever the word is. It was a very tormenting period in the history of Klal Yisrael. Nevertheless, it's what made us who we are. So it's not bad, it's good, as we pointed out many times before. Now, after that, so he goes on to explain the history after that. So then, after we receive the Torah at Har Sinai, so we are now wandering around in the Midbar for those 40 years, all because of a mistake. Once again, we sin by the chet of the egel, the golden calf, and we do the sin of the meraglim, of the spies, and we are stuck there in the Midbar, in the wilderness for 40 years, and Hashem is doing like an ethnic cleansing, so to speak, getting rid of all the people that make mistakes, so that when we go into Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be a nation that is holding in a place of shleimus, of perfection. Eventually, Hashem is going to appoint a monarch who we are going to know as Dovid HaMelech, and Dovid HaMelech is going to be again, that's after 40 years, Yoshua brings us into Eretz Yisrael, and as we'll see, there were a lot of issues coming into Eretz Yisrael, in the beginning of Eretz Yisrael. We'll see that as we go along, and eventually we'll come to Dovid HaMelech, who's going to be the king. Dovid will not be zeicher to build the Beis HaMikdash for different reasons, but his son, Shlomo HaMelech, he will be the one that is zeicher, that merits to build the Beis HaMikdash, and the Beis HaMikdash is the place in which is enshrined and venerated as a supreme law, meaning the Torah itself shines in the Beis HaMikdash, the Torah itself is radiating and permeating from the Beis HaMikdash, and as long as there was a Beis HaMikdash standing in Yerushalayim, in the center of everything for Klal Yisrael, so then Torah was supreme amongst our nation. However, as we shall see, as we go through this Tehillim, again we're giving the historical background so we can understand the kingdom of Dovid HaMelech, as we've learned through many of the Tehillim that we had so far, even though that he was chosen by Hashem, clearly chosen by Hashem, he didn't go unchallenged. And from the earliest of times, one of the Shvatim, one of the tribes, which was very powerful, was Ephraim. And the heir of the royal line of Yosef, that's Ephraim, demanded dominion. They wanted to be the rulers over Eretz Yisrael. And they were very proud that Yoshua ben Nun, who was Moshe Rabbeinu's main disciple, was from none less than the tribe of Ephraim. And he was the one who conquered Eretz Yisrael. And when the Mishkan, when the tabernacle was placed in Shiloh, which is where it was for quite some time, for 369 years, that was also in the territory of Ephraim. So Ephraim, we'll have to see what's the story with Ephraim, what is so bad, what's happened, we'll have to see what's going on. But Lamaisa says, Rav Foyer over here, there was a very big battle over Dovid HaMelech's reign and the tribe of Ephraim. Now he writes like this, that when the spiritual and political capital of Israel was transferred to Yerushalayim, again, as long as the Mishkan was in Shiloh, so Shiloh then is like the capital of Eretz Yisrael because that's where the Mishkan is. However, eventually they'll bring the Mishkan to Yerushalayim, and then the Beis HaMikdash will be built there. So therefore the capital was transferred over to Yerushalayim. Now, Ephraim would not forget about its earlier glory, which meant that as long as the Mishkan was in Shiloh, which was in the land of Ephraim, it made Ephraim powerful. So there was a wicked king by the name of Yerovam ben Nebat, and he was from the tribe of Ephraim, and he got up and he began challenging Shlomo HaMelech. So Dovid was the king, his son Shlomo took over after him. Yerovam ben Nebat begins to challenge Shlomo HaMelech. Eventually, the 10 tribes secede from the rule, and those 10 tribes, the lost 10 tribes, I guess we'll call them, they're known collectively as the tribe of Ephraim. So Ephraim pushed them out, so to speak, from amongst the nation, and therefore they're all known as Ephraim. Now, this is just the historic Yerovam ben Nebat. Can we open the veil for you, Mrs. Cruz?
Actually,
no. Okay. No problem. Okay. Now, the Malbim and Rav Hirsch, as we're going to see, we'll see them both. They both learn that this psalm, this Tehillim over here, is a firm proclamation. It's going to take time to get there, but Hashem recognizes that only Dovid and his offspring are the true Torah rulers of Eretz Yisrael, of Klal Yisrael. Who's going to be the Mashiach at the end of days? That's going to be the monarch. That's going to be the king of Klal Yisrael. It's got to be one that is coming from the offspring of David HaMelech. He despised the tents of Yosef, the tribe of Ephraim, as we'll see towards the very end of this Tehillim over here. He did not choose them. Rather, he chose, as we'll see, David HaMelech and his offspring, and Har Tzion, which is where David HaMelech and Shlomo Melech set up the Beis HaMikdash and set up the rulership of Klal Yisrael. So that is the introduction. Again, it's 400 years of history that is going to unfold itself in front of our eyes. And it's going to be somewhat confusing, but says Rafael, don't be confused because this is the way that it works in Klal Yisrael. Even when it looks like there's no rhyme and reason, HaKadosh Baruch Hu very clearly always knows exactly what it is that he's doing. So Rav Hirsch also has what I would call it like a Hagdam introduction into this Tehillim. It's rather lengthy. I can't say all the words, but we'll try to go through the main points that he brings down over here, that we should understand how Rav Hirsch's perspective is on this Tehillim. And he says like this. This one, Ayin Ches, number 78, it proclaims a truth which all of Yisrael should take to heart for all times to come. And that is, what is the truth that we are going to hear again and again in this Tehillim? That we need to take it to heart and hold on to it. And that is that an essential part of our loyalty to Hashem and the basic prerequisite for our welfare as a nation to remain ever mindful of our historical origin, of our historic purpose as a nation, and the demonstration of Hashem's sovereignty which we witnessed in all the course of our history. What does that mean? History is a lesson for Klal Yisrael to learn from. It's not a newspaper where if you would go back in probably newspapers 100 years ago, all the headlines are going to be pretty much more or less the same that they are today. Just different names. Maybe a little bit of nuances that are different, but more or less history repeats itself. Says Rav Hirsch, history for Klal Yisrael certainly repeats itself. And every single incident that we learn in the Torah and Tanakh, every little detail that is there, is to teach us of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is demanding and expecting of each and every one of us. So that in future generations, we do not make the terrible mistakes that the previous generations made. We should not follow in the footsteps of our fathers, of our ancestors, who did the wrong things. We're supposed to look at the Torah, see where they made a mistake, see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was not happy with that mistake. He punished them as a result of that. And then we're supposed to log it over here in our memory banks and realize when we have an opportunity and we're in such a similar situation, we have to act differently. And he says all the past errors that took place, all the misfortunes, they befell Klal Yisrael because of a consequence. That's a consequence because the Jewish people did something wrong. HaKadosh Baruch Hu acts midah keneged midah, measure for measure. And whenever he sees the Jewish people stepping out of line, he has to put them back in place. And therefore, that if the reason that the Jewish people made so many mistakes over hundreds of years of history is because the memory of our past history had grown dim in their eyes. If I would remember, it's like a person is allergic to a certain food, but they happen to love that kind of food. So they eat that food, and then they have aches and pains and cramps and stomach and this and that, and it's a hard night, and they know that. And so the next time around that they want to eat the food, they say, listen, last week, it was not comfortable, I was in a lot of pain, I had a hard night sleeping, I'm not going to have it this week. But you know what? 3-4 weeks down the road, when that food appears itself once again on the table, and your husband is gobbling it up, and it looks so yummy and so delicious, so suddenly you forget about all those pains, and you forget about the cramps, and you forget about the sleepless night, and you indulge yourself again, and then history repeats itself all over again. Says Rav Hirsch, the nature of Klal Yisrael is we made major mistakes in our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Torah talks about them so that we should know what not to do in the coming generations. But, as is the nature of time, time not only heals all wounds, but it also makes you forget what once was, and therefore we forget that by doing this activity and this action and making this blunder and falling into this trap, so whatever happened before is going to happen to us again. And therefore, the 400 years that we're going to view over here in this Tehillim, and then again we have to translate it into the thousands of years that have existed since this time, of all the numerous mistakes that Klal Yisrael has made, it comes because we forget. We forget our history, we forget our past, we forget the mistakes, and we don't pay attention. If we would be more cognizant of the mistakes of our history, and we would be much more aware of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hand that's involved in everything, watching over us and keeping track of it all, then perhaps we'd be strong enough to make the right decision right now. So he says like this, and he defines Jewish history, and we'll see in the Malbim as well, in a really magnificent way that should give us a lot of CHIZUK of what it means. And he says every historic event of our past is much more than just factual significance. It's not just that this happened and here's the facts. No. Because the truth which is proclaimed through every such act of Hashem, it becomes, as we'll see in this pasuk over here, I forgot to read the pasuk. The pasuk says like this, the first verse, Maskil li Asaf, an instruction by Asaf, Hazinu Ami, my people, listen, incline your ear, Toirasi hatu, listen to my Torah, Hatu aznechem li'imei, I want you to bend your ear to the words of my mouth. That's the first verse, and then the second verse over here says, Eftecha b'mashal pi, I'll open my mouth with a parable, Abi echidos minei kedem, and I'll solve the riddles from antiquity. So mashal, which normally means parable, and echida, which normally means a riddle. Says Rav Hirsch over here about these words. He says mashal is also a language of moshel, which means to rule. And that is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu there's a certain pattern which HaKadosh Baruch Hu set up in this world, in which that if we could understand what that pattern is, we could understand how Hashem is ruling over this world, so then we'll be able to make our judgments better when it presents itself in front of us. When we can derive an explanation for the events of any given era and the solutions for the problems of any given time. Meaning, I'm not living in a vacuum of time right now. Whatever's happening right now in Klal Yisrael, you could look back 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, maybe 3,000 years even, maybe even more, and you can see, like Chazal tell us, Maisa Avos Siman Labanim, that which took place and happened to the Avos HaKadoshim, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and their wives, it's a siman, it's a sign for what's going to be to their children. Which means whatever happened before, it's just happening again right now. If Klal Yisrael was in a similar situation 2,000 years ago, and they made a mistake in the way that they acted and perceived it, and dealt with it, and they were punished as a result, so then I don't think that I want to make the same mistake that they made 2,000 years ago, because that could bring about chorban, that could bring about a gullus, that could bring about infighting, that could bring about assimilation, that could bring about a total destruction of Klal Yisrael. I don't want that. Says Rav Hirsch, and therefore, if you can look back in history, not as facts, but as reality, it's a reality the way that Klal Yisrael behaved and the way that Hashem reacted to our behavior, so then I'll be able to make a much better judgment here in my times. And he says, the happenings of present day pose us chidot, the riddles. Everything going on right now is a riddle, which is very difficult to solve unless you have the insight and you can study the truths which are demonstrated in our past history, which we learned from the Torah itself. So how can you figure out what the answer to a riddle is, the riddle of life that we are living in right now, of all the unknowns that are taking place in front of our eyes? I know Syria just fell. There's things going on in the world today that defies imagination. Russia's, who knows what's going to be? World War III, there's going to be the whole world. Who knows what's going to happen? Nobody knows. But we have to look back in our history. We have to begin to try to examine things. We have to see what is going on. And then we can begin to solve the problems and understand why and how HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing the things right now in our time. So it's not just the 400 years that the Jewish people were struggling with. It's a message that goes on for all time. And that's what he writes over here. It's the task of every generation of Jews to hand down to posterity the historic traditions they receive from their fathers, so that even the generations of the remotest future may always be mindful of Yisrael's eternal mission, the consequences when we make mistakes, or the failure to do so. And that eternal mission is to be obedient and loyal to Hashem. That's our mission. So when you see back 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 500 years ago, the Jewish people were disloyal to Hashem. Look what He did. So then we have to remind ourselves, I must be loyal, I must be obedient, I must be makabel, accept the Torah upon myself and the mitzvahs, even when it's difficult. How somebody asked a question yesterday in our shir in the afternoon, if somebody would pay you $30 million, they say to a man, if someone would pay you $30 million not to put on your tefillin for one day, what would you do? $30 million cash, and Uncle Sam won't take a penny. You know, walk away $30 million cash, not to put on your tefillin for one day. What would you do? So it was up for discussion. It was up for discussion. Now what's the discussion? HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, you have a mitzvah to put on your tefillin every single day. No one's holding a gun to your head and saying not put on your tefillin. No one's threatening to kill your family if you don't put on your tefillin, or not put it on. They're saying, I'll give you $30 million if you don't put on your tefillin. What? The word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is binding. The word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is eternal from Har Sinai. A Yid puts on tefillin every single day. There's no choice. So what's the question? But it's a question, because there were those that said, well, man. Somebody said, no question. He said, what, you never had a day you didn't put on tefillin? So he said, no, in whatever it is, 30, 40 years, I put on tefillin every single day. No, come on, I'm sure there was one day. No, there's no days. A person puts on tefillin every single day, whether he's getting paid $30 million not to put it on, but you don't know the reward in the world to come. You have no idea what's going on. Hashem decreed that we're supposed to do it. Now, we have to learn from our past. If in previous generations people were making mistakes and they were getting punished as a result of that because they were disloyal to our HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it means that Hashem is driving home the point we are supposed to be loyal to Hashem. The Horowitz, we told over this story, I'm sure, many times. The Horowitz, when he was a rather young man, I believe in his 20s, he was getting severe migraine headaches, and he could not learn. And the doctor told him, Horowitz Yisrael Meir, he said, if you want to save your head, your brain, for the rest of your life, you cannot learn for the next year. Because there's too much of a strain on your brain, it's hurting you too much, you need to desist from learning Torah for the next year. In Mitzvah Hashem, you'll have a refuah shlem, and you go back to learning. And the Horowitz said, nothing? He said, nothing. You can't learn a single thing. Even little things is too much strain for your brain at this point. So the Horowitz said, listen, how about Tanakh? I won't even go into the Mefarshim. Just let me learn Tanakh, the Psukim, from Chumash all the way to the end of Ksuvim. Can I do that? So the doctor said, if you're laying in bed and you're doing it casually and easily and you're not using your brain too much, then yes, you can learn Tanakh. That's all you can learn for that year. So the Horowitz Chaim, it is, the way the story goes is that year he didn't learn Gemara, he didn't learn Shulchan Aruch, he didn't learn Rishonim, he didn't learn Achronim, he didn't learn nothing except Tanakh. And he became, with his ingenious mind, he became a baki, a expert in all of the words of Tanakh. And for the rest of his life, the Chavetz Chaim, when anything would be taking place historically in the world at that time, any major event, anything would be going on, he would always relate it back to something that he had learned, that he understood in Tanakh. And he would say, it's the same thing that's going on over here. And he would quote the Psukim, and he'd say, this has happened before, just take a look over there and Sefer Yoshua, take a look over there in Yecheskel, take a look in Yirmiyahu, take a look over here. You'll see it all happened before. We must make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. And a lot of his exhortations, a lot of his, that the Teichacha, the rebuke that he would give to Klal Yisrael, was based upon his deep understanding of Jewish history from the Tanakh itself. So that's what we're saying. We cannot be living in a vacuum. We cannot be with our, like the ostrich with his head down in the sand. Our eyes have to be open. Our ears have to hear what HaKadosh Baruch has said throughout the thousands of years of our history, and realize that if they were disloyal to Hashem, and that's what happened, the same thing will happen to us, Rahman al-Islam, and therefore, but by being loyal, we find the Jews are always salvation. Klal Yisrael was in Mitzrayim, and they were living a life of Mitzrayim, of Egyptians. They were totally assimilated, black magic, you name it, Avodah Zarah, everything. But one day they cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Hashem says, oh, the Jews are still Jews, I'll come down and I'll save them. Because whenever we are loyal to Hashem, Hashem cannot say no to the Jewish people. And we have to keep this in mind. Now, that's the first part of Rav Hirsch. Then he says, if you look further in this Tehillim over here, Asaf begins to document the truth of the basic thought as a survey of Yisrael's history from the days of Moshe to the reign of Dovid HaMelech. And that is that there's a chain that goes from Moshe Rabbeinu to Dovid HaMelech, whatever is going to be in between over there, which is going to be problematic, so that we have to wipe away, meaning you have to acknowledge it, but we have to stay away from there. And the main thing is that Dovid HaMelech is the link in the chain of Torah from Moshe to Dovid HaMelech, and he is going to be the monarch, the leader, the king of Klal Yisrael, because he's going to be the king of Torah that's going to pass it down to the Jewish people. So he says like this. He says that there was as we mentioned in the early introduction, there was the generation of the tribe of Ephraim, and they seemingly forgot about Yetzias Mitzrayim, and they forgot about the Dor Midbar. Now, the Yetzias Mitzrayim is when we were enslaved, and we became enslaved because, as he's saying, we have to be humble to be able to serve Hashem in the right way. We made mistakes over there. Dor Midbar was when they were in the Midbar. They received the Torah, and they made mistakes. And as a result, they had to wander around 40 years, and they had to lose the majority of the nation until they were a supercharged 2.0 Klal Yisrael, able to go into Eretz Yisrael. However, the tribe of Ephraim failed to learn from Yetzias Mitzrayim that Klal Yisrael owed its freedom and independence solely to the act of its direct divine intervention. The reason that we were able to go out of Mitzrayim is because Hashem intervened. And Hashem was mashkiach, He's watching over us. And they forgot to consider another lesson. And that is from the history of the Dor Midbar. That while they were in the Midbar, what did we learn over there? Hashem is the source of all prosperity, of all good fortune, and it only will endure if we follow the will of Hashem. Hashem brought man falling down min hashamayim. There's the Be'er Shel Miriam. There was the well of Miriam that was following them around everywhere to give them water. The Ananiah covered the clouds of glory, covering them on all sides to make sure that the enemies can never get to us. Temperature always good. Clothing never wore out. Shoes never wore out. Everything was taken care of. But that's only if you do the will of Hashem. A person was supposed to be a maimin, was supposed to trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu when the man was falling down min hashamayim. And that was that you'll have exactly what you need for that day, no more, no less. And if you try to take more, what did Hashem make it do? It's spoiled. You can't take more than you deserve. And if you were a tzaddik, you opened up your door in the morning and the man was sitting right there on your doorstep. And if you're not such a tzaddik, you had to go travel, you had to go walk down to the store to go get it. And sometimes you had to go, that certain half you had to go down to a farther store. Because the worse that you were, the less loyal and devout you were to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hashem reminded you, this is what happens to the person that is not devout and loyal to Hashem. So therefore, this tribe of Ephraim, as we're going to see through the Tehillim, they seem to forget about all these messages. And therefore, they fail to see the truth to be inferred from the events of Kivros Taiva, which was one of the places that when they were in the Midbar, when they welled up with all these lowly desires for the things of this world, and they didn't realize that when a person wants to chase after the desires of this world, automatically they're separating themselves from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And then instead of Hashem turning towards you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu turns away from you. If you engage yourself in the base desires of this world, when you could cleave to Hashem, you could do His mitzvahs, you could have amunah about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you see His hashgacha brothers, and you're looking for other things, so then what's going to happen? Hashem is going to leave you into the hands of the nations and the riches and the gashmis that you are pursuing. And that's why He says over here that real bliss and real simcha of a Jew is the destiny that's apportioned to it by the extraordinary decree of Hashem. If I see everything that HaKadosh Baruch has given me, and I see all the brachas in my life, I see the brachas in Klal Yisrael, I see all the good that Hashem is constantly raining down on this world, on our nation, on our lives. So that's really my simcha, that I'm close to Hashem. However, to turn with envy and regret the riches which other nations possess and the pleasure that they enjoy, that is a very big mistake of Klal Yisrael. When you're driving down the street and you see other people's things and you want what other people have, other people's cars and you want their cars, you see other people's lives and you want their lives, that's not the way of Klal Yisrael. Klal Yisrael is HaKadosh Baruch Hu is taking care of my life. Everything that He gives me is perfect, exactly the way that it should be. Didn't I learn that from Mitzrayim? Didn't I learn that from the travels in the Midbar? Didn't I learn that Hashem takes care of everything and gives everybody exactly what they need? And when the tribe of Ephraim, as we will see, did not recognize that, it brought a lot of troubles and a lot of tension into Klal Yisrael. So he says, the Dor Midbar, that generation that was in the wilderness, never would have fallen victim to the errors that were to prove so ruinous if they would have just remained mindful of the hand of Hashem, that they saw for themselves as it chastised the Egyptians at the time of the Exodus from Egypt. If they would have remembered, look what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for us. He made so many miracles and nisim and evlais, and He took care of the Egyptians, He destroyed them, He drowned them in the waters, and we went free, and we got into the Midbar, we got the Torah. How could it be a slave nation? 50 days later receives the Torah? Can you imagine you get a homeless guy from the end of from over there by the freeway entrance or the exit? The guy's living in a box. He doesn't have a house to go in. He has no money to his name. You take him into your house. You give him a shower. You give him some new clothes. You rehabilitate him for 50 days, and then you make him the CEO of a company? Who would do such a thing? HaKadosh Baruch Hu took a nation from slavery of 400 years in Mitzrayim. He cleaned us out after 50 days, and He brought us in. He gave us the greatest gift in the history of the world, Torah. That's all you have to remember, says our verse. Remember what Hashem did for us. Why are you running elsewhere? Why are you looking at other things? And this was their mistake. The nation which settled in the land was infected with the rebellious spirit of Ephraim and lacked all understanding of their father's historical experiences, which is a frightening thing. Meaning, whatever, as we'll see as we go through this, whatever it is that Ephraim actually did, which was wrong, so that means that when the nation was heading into Eretz Yisrael, again, they were supposed to be spiritually cleansed from the mistakes of the Meraglim, of the Chet Egel and the like. And Yoshua is now given charge by Moshe to take him into Eretz Yisrael. Yoshua is from the tribe of Ephraim. And the Ephraimites, as he calls them, they were doing things that were not so good with perspective or with respect to their historical perspective. So they come in now, this nation, they are infected with this ideology and this outlook on life. And that is, we don't recognize what took place in the past is going to repeat itself once again over here, and therefore we must behave accordingly. This was their problem. And therefore he says that it's only through the election of Dovid HaMelech that the nation was given a prospect for a new and better future. So it's tumultuous from coming into Eretz Yisrael until Dovid HaMelech is going to be named the Melech, the king over the nation. For it was expected that Dovid would know how to keep the people ever mindful of the bonds that bounded to Hashem forever. Dovid was different than every other king. Dovid was, his Torah was his life. Clinging to HaKadosh Baruch Hu was his life, as we see up until now, even in the darkest moments of his existence. Dovid HaMelech was always striving to get close to Hashem. The whole world's crumbling around him, and Dovid HaMelech is singing songs to Hashem, how much he loves Hashem. So Dovid HaMelech is going to be the leader that is going to awaken the masses and reveal to Klal Yisrael who HaKadosh Baruch Hu truly is and what our mission is here in this world. So the Malbim says on these words, the Malbim says like this, and we're in first, and still in the first pasuk. He says, "V'siper kol koros Yisrael, be'istzeisa mimitzrayim ad Melech David." This Tehillim tells over all of the stories of Klal Yisrael from the time that they left Mitzrayim until Dovid HaMelech becomes the king. Loimar, to tell us, Shagam shayadoris machisim, even though that there were generations who angered HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yod Hashem ki yakum dor ki levavo yiru yichu musa. HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew that there's eventually going to be a time when the generation would rise, whose heart was what HaKadosh Baruch Hu was looking for, where they would fear Hashem, and they would accept His musa, they would accept His rebuke. And then that king would arise, and he would end up building the Beis HaMikdash, and that Beis HaMikdash is going to be the place where total shleimus, completion, is going to come. V'tikun kilkul ador shlefanav, and then it will be a rectification of the mistakes of the generations that existed before it. V'tachlis v'achris v'tikva l'doros habayim ad eis l'kates, and that will be a tachlis, a purpose, and an end result, and a hope for all of the generations that will come afterwards, until the Kates, until Mashiach is going to come. Meaning, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is watching the faults, the downfall of Klal Yisrael. But He never destroyed us, and He never gave up on us. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows, again, Hashem has infinite wisdom, He can see into the future while things are happening right now. But it's more than that. Hashem knows that there is going to be a nation of Klal Yisrael that will arise in the world that will listen and do what Hashem wants. There will be a leader that is going to stand up to the enemies and stand up for Klal Yisrael and for the sake of the Torah itself. And he will impart all of these lessons, all of these teachings, all of this Torah to our nation. And then that will be a tikkun, that will be a correction of all the kilkul, of all the mistakes that were made up until this point. Any time that we rectify the mistakes of the past, so we're being mistaken, we're fixing things up. Sometimes, somebody builds a house, they build a building, they made mistakes in the building. And then maybe you catch it early on, maybe it takes sometimes 5, 10, 20 years. What do? Then you have to call in the contractor, maybe it's the same one, maybe you don't trust him, so you call in another contractor. And he comes and he examines the plans, and he looks at the foundations, and he looks at the walls, and he looks at the design. And he sees where it's weak, and he comes in and he corrects and he fixes to make it into a strong edifice. And so this house is going to be able to stand and exist for years to come. Whenever Klal Yisrael is rectifying the mistakes of the past, so it re-solidifies our foundations of Torah, of Amunah, of being close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then it's all worth it, even if Hashem has to endure hundreds of years, and right now thousands of years of galus, of exile, of being far away from what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. But He knows that it can always get better, and someone's going to rise to the challenge to make it better. And therefore it says in the pasuk, Hazinu ami terasi, my nation, listen carefully to my Torah. Ki b'shir hazeh, in this Tehillim, which he calls a song, Yisapir koros ha'avos kipshutam. It tells over the events of the previous generations simply. There's no hidden messages over here. There's no Kabbalistic details. It just tells over the story of Klal Yisrael from Yitzias Mitzrayim until Dovid became the king. I'm sorry, my mistake. Anan Sipor Koros Yisrael Nivdol Ma'od Mikoros Yisrael. However, our stories, our history, is much different than the history books that you will find from the nations of the world. Why? Everything that happened to Klal Yisrael, it's all with tremendous amount of hashgacha pratis, divine intervention, and the miracles and the wonders of Hashem. Meaning, even when you look at just the simple story unfolding of 400 years of our history, and you see there was Klal Yisrael in the Midbar, and then you see that they ended up coming to Eretz Yisrael, and you see the challenges, Shalom Melech is a little bit glossed over here in this, and you see Yeravam and Nabat, and you see the tribe of Abraham, you see everything that was going on. So it looks very simple. It looks like that's just history, that's the way that it works out. If you open up a history book, you'll see these things, but it's not that. It is a much greater level of depth, says the Malbim, and that is that everything that is happening to Klal Yisrael, unlike the nations of the world, everything that is happening to our nation it's all with tremendous hashgacha, pratis, divine intervention, which means everything that happens to us, to Klal Yisrael, is a hashgacha, pratis reaction that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is bringing into the world based on what we do. The nations of the world, he's saying, it's not like that. Napoleon Bonaparte did not have hashgacha pratis the way the Klal Yisrael does. And the Mesopotamians and the Civil War in America and it was not under the hashgacha the way that we are. Every little detail of the life, of the history of Klal Yisrael only moves a step forward or a step back because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one that is watching over everything and he's interacting with all of us. Ad Shiyadias Koros Yisrael B'Yimei Kedem, until the earliest understandings of the events that took place of Klal Yisrael, He atzma Torah ve'amuna, that is Torah and that is Amuna. Meaning, when you read history of Klal Yisrael and you see what took place, and it's all laid out in Tanakh the way that it is, so that is Torah, that is our Torah, and that is our Amuna, that is our faith as well. You can develop Amuna from going through the history of Klal Yisrael and seeing how HaKadosh Baruch Hu interacts with us. When you hear a story from the Holocaust of the way that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved somebody's life, that builds one's Amunah. When you look back 200 years or 300 years or 400 years, 500 years, you see something that took place in the Inquisition, how certain people were saved in the most miraculous ways, that will build your Amunah. When you see even that somebody was punished for something that they did wrong, and you realize because of what they did, so Mida Keneged Mida, HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought that to them, that will build your Amunah b'HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and something called Hashgacha Pratis. Hashem is watching every single one of us. He knows what we are doing. He knows what's going on, and therefore He is reacting to us all of the time in such a way. So history is to be mechazik our Amunah, to strengthen our faith in Hashem, our faith in what it says in the Torah, our faith in the responsibility of what it means to be a Jew. And that's why it's important to go back and see how everything took place, and never to say, what a coincidence. Wow, what a coincidence. What a coincidence that Hitler just happened to be in Berlin at that time. No, chas v'chalila. What a coincidence. The Romans happened to have, they were a strong army, they came into Yerushalayim and they destroyed the base of Mikdash. There's no such thing as coincidence in our history. Coincidence is not for the Jewish people. Everything is b'hashgacha pratis. Ki bam noida mitzias Hashem, through the historical events of our nation, the reality of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is known. We learn about his abilities. We learn about his hashgacha, the way that he watches over us and intervenes on our behalf, either for the good or sometimes even chalila for the bad. And we learn about scharoi va'ainsho. We learn about the reward and the punishment that is always in a balance that Hashem is going to decide for Klal Yisrael as a nation and for a person as an individual as well. Meaning that part of the world of Hashgacha Pratis is the Ribbono Shel Olam is always watching what is going on. And he's making decisions how he's going to respond to our actions. Will it be something that merits us reward or something that is going to get us a punishment? That's Hashem's decision. Now, even, if even in the world of punishment, we don't believe in that the punishment is coming fully as a wrath from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We believe that it's coming for our benefit. Even when we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu responded in harsh ways to Klal Yisrael, it wasn't because he's a wrathful God. It is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to rectify and redirect the nation. And therefore, if you're stepping out of line and you're way off the grid of what it means to be a Jew, says Hashem, what can I do to bring you back? I tried to warn you. I tried to give you inside information. I tried to give you rebuke. You're not listening to me. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what should I do? So I have no choice sometimes but to bring down the punishments. That's the einish, that's the punishment. But even in the punishment itself is part of the rectification of the mistakes that we are making as a nation. So if a person is a maimin, they believe in Hashem, and they look through the course of history and they see why Hashem did, to the best of our ability to understand what he did, so it's mechazik, it strengthens our emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that even when he's punishing, it's all with an ulterior motive, and that is, he just wants to bring us back to him. He's not trying to be spiteful and wrathful and sadistic or a masochist, chas v'chalila. HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves us. If a parent loves their children, they're not miserable, awful people. If they love their children, even when they have to punish, even if they have to punch. I know today you're not allowed to punch anymore, but in the olden days, when you were allowed to punch, it wasn't because we hate our children, it's because we love our children. And we want to make sure that they stay on a path that is appropriate for them. And so therefore, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu does what he does, it is all for our benefit. Says the Malbim, L'chein, that's why it says, listen to my Torah, and listen carefully to the words of my mouth. The superficial details of the events which took place, those are the words in my mouth. But there's a penimis, there's a much deeper message behind what I'm telling you, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is, you got to listen carefully. If you listen carefully, if you study the words of Tanakh in depth and you understand how history unfolded itself, you'll begin to see HaKadosh Baruch Hu everywhere in our history. And you will see that nothing happened by chance and by mistake. It was all calculated with precision by Hashem. What does that mean for us? That means the same thing. We're supposed to learn from the mistakes of our ancestors in the past, and then we have to reroute ourselves, and we have to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do. And not continue. Why is it that on Yom Kippur, one of the things that we have to ask Mechila for is for the sins of our fathers? What does my father have to do with me? What does my Zayda have to do with me? What does the altar from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, have to do with me? I'm living my life. I'm responsible for myself. What do I have to do? Because if, the Mepharshim explain, if you continue to live up to the sins of your forefathers, which means whatever mistakes they made, you continue to do those things yourself, then you did not let go yet. And you continue to follow in their not right ways. So if there's an ancestor somewhere out there, if there's a parent somewhere out there that did the wrong things, and you continue the wrong things as a result of that, so then you're held accountable because you didn't learn from history. You didn't learn that they made mistakes. You didn't learn it's the wrong thing. You didn't learn that you shouldn't be behaving in such a way. And you have to behave better. And therefore, on Yom Kippur, I'm obligated to say, Hashem, forgive me for the sins of my fathers and forefathers. Why? Because it must be that I'm still holding on to their sins. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in the situation I'm in right now. And therefore, says Rav Hirsch, says the Malbim, says Rav Foyer, in all of these Hagdama, this introduction to this Tehillim over here, that is, we have to know that the main goal is that we remain loyal and connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We can use our illustrious history of Klal Yisrael to learn what exactly that means. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu is pleased with our behavior and when He's disappointed with our behavior, and not to stumble into the same paths that brought us punishments and difficulties, but rather we have to take the higher road, like the Malbim is saying over here. And Hashem lets history continue to run and the years continue to go on because He knows eventually there will be a nation of Klal Yisrael that will have the hearts to hear and the ears to listen carefully and will do what Hashem wants. And that's with the monarchy of Dovid HaMelech, who came into this world and then left this world. But when it will return, when it will be restored, that will be the ultimate reward that Hashem will bring us with the Bi'az Goyal Tzedek B'mheira V'yameinu. To be continued.